Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really dense but absolutely fascinating 2020 academic dissertation by Maura Marquise. We're going to unpack how the stories we tell on a daily basis might literally be the key to saving the world. It's a super timely topic, taking a hard look at where literature, history, and the very real ecological crises we're all living through actually intersect.
Okay, think about this for a second, because it's a pretty wild hook. What if the destruction of our planet isn't just the result of some innate, unavoidable human nature? What if instead it's the result of one specific myth that we've been telling ourselves for centuries? We hear it all the time, right? That humans are inherently destructive, and as long as we're around, we're destined to ruin the Earth. But what if that idea is really just a narrative, a culturally constructed story that we've all kind of just blindly accepted as absolute truth?
This brings us to our main source for today, Maura Marquise's 2020 PhD dissertation from UNC Chapel Hill titled The Dialectic of Myth. In it, she takes a deep dive into how contemporary novels use ancient, traditional, and indigenous myths to completely rethink our environmental crisis. She's really looking at how these authors challenge the deeply ingrained ideas we hold about humanity's relationship with nature. So, to get started, we really need to talk about this word, the Anthropocene. It's the label we use for our current era of climate change and ecological collapse. But Marquise points out a major flaw in this word. By using the Greek prefix for human, the term essentially blames the entire human species across all of history for the crisis. And Marquise argues that this actually obscures a really important fact. This massive ecological destruction stems largely from one specific cultural legacy, not from humanity as a whole.
Let's quickly map out where we're headed in this explainer. 1. The Anthropocene crisis. 2. The Enlightenment myth. 3. Lessons from indigenous myths. 4. African futurism and radical change. And finally, 5. A pluriverse of meaning.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Anthropocene crisis. Is destruction our fate? You know, contemporary novels like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas and Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy actually hit the nail on the head when it comes to this exact dread. When you first start reading them, these books show societies totally trapped in this vicious cycle of violent mechanical destruction. They depict worlds where people genuinely believe the laws of nature are fundamentally violent and competitive, which leads them to think, well, human nature must be too. But these authors use this super bleak setup to ask a brilliant question. Are we naturally ecocidal, or do we literally just lack a better narrative to live by?
Moving on to Section 2, the Enlightenment myth and the global monoculture.
Marquise actually traces this specific story back a long way. We're talking ancient Greek ideals here. Think of Homer's Odysseus using reason to conquer nature and other people. She shows how this lineage flows right through 17th century thinkers like Descartes, who viewed nature as nothing more than a lifeless, totally mechanical machine. Then we see it get weaponized during British colonialism, pushing right up to the dominant global monoculture we have today. This timeline tracks the evolution of one very specific idea, that human reason is meant to tame and master an inert natural world.
Now, check out this stark contrast because it's absolutely crucial. On one hand, you've got the Enlightenment view, this global monoculture that sees nature as a passive backdrop, essentially just a mechanical resource sitting there for human mastery. But on the other hand, you have alternative worldviews. These are myths that understand nature as a vibrant, animated web of interdependence, where humans are just one small part of a much larger kinship system. Marquise points out that the Enlightenment myth claims to be objective science, deliberately labeling everything else as primitive magic or superstition just to maintain its dominance.
Marquise sums this up perfectly in this quote. She writes that our environmental doom is not hardwired into our biology. It is not our absolute fate. Instead, it's a byproduct of this deeply ingrained cultural narrative that insists we must dominate the Earth to survive. And the so what here is pretty incredibly hopeful. If the story is the problem, then changing the story can actually be the solution.
Which brings us to Section 3, Lessons from Indigenous Myths, Kinship over Mastery.
Let's look at Alexis Wright's novel Carpentaria. It dives deep into the Wanya Aboriginal dreaming. Now, this isn't just folklore. Marquise highlights this as a highly sophisticated ecological knowledge system. It's a system that proves humans actually can thrive in fragile environments for over 60,000 years without destroying them. The dreaming completely erases the Western split between mind and matter. In this view, rivers are relatives. Rock formations are ancestors. Your identity isn't based on how you stand apart from nature. It's rooted in how deeply related you are to it. It fosters this lived responsibility that makes extractive domination completely unthinkable. All right, Section 4, African Futurism and Radical Change, Creating Mythic Bricolage. Here, Marquis points out how author Nnedi Okorafor is actively dismantling a pretty toxic colonial hierarchy. For centuries, the Enlightenment myth has propped up Western science as civilized, while casually dismissing indigenous and traditional knowledge as primitive magic. According to Marquis, Okorafor shatters this racist dichotomy by placing ancient traditions right side by side with hyper-advanced technology.
Take Okorafor's African futurist novel Lagoon, for instance. You've got aliens landing in the waters off Lagos, Nigeria, but this isn't your standard Hollywood sci-fi invasion. These aliens actually merge with ancient Pan-African water deities and Yoruba gods. And the aliens teach that true technology isn't about building machines to master the Earth. Technology is actually about mutability and the ability to change. By combining extraterrestrials with traditional deities, the novel creates what Marquis calls a mythic bricolage. It's a fusion that makes radical, nonviolent ecological change, like society collectively agreeing to just drop petrocapitalism overnight, feel completely imaginable. And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, A Pluriverse of Meaning, Resurrecting Buried Traditions.
To see how this works in a European context, Marquis looks at Susanna Clarke's historical fantasy novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Set right during the Industrial Revolution, we see this brilliant historical clash. It pits modern magic, which represents the rational, dominating Enlightenment urge to control everything, against an older, much more nature-based European tradition, fairy magic.
This clash is a fantastic illustration of the Celtic fairy faith, and it proves that Europe itself has these rich, suppressed histories of living in ecological kinship. The Enlightenment worked really hard to trivialize fairies into, tiny winged creatures for kids. But in traditional myth, fairies are human-sized, incredibly powerful nature spirits that demand respect. They actually enforce ecological prohibitions, like forbidding you from cutting down certain trees or harming specific animals. And Marquis argues this totally shatters the illusion that the Enlightenment's destructive rationalism is just a universal European trait. Even in the West, there are these buried myths reminding us that we aren't exceptional masters, but kin with the natural world.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, there's a quote highlighted in the dissertation from scholars Blazer and Della Cadena that hits the nail on the head. Inasmuch as knowledges are world-making practices, they tend to make the worlds they know. Our stories, our myths, our truths, they aren't just harmless fiction. They literally build our world. If we believe nature is a dead machine meant for us to extract from, we'll build a world that destroys it. If we believe it's a living web we are deeply connected to, we'll build a world that sustains it.
So, how do we actually achieve this kind of ecological change? According to Marquis, surviving the Anthropocene boils down to a few key steps. First, we have to recognize that the Enlightenment legacy isn't some pure objective reality. It's a humanly constructed myth. Second, we have to stop the colonial habit of treating indigenous and traditional knowledge as primitive. And third, we need to abandon this quest for a single global monoculture. Instead, Marquis argues we need to embrace a pluriverse, a beautifully diverse collection of local myths, whether they're newly created or resurrected from the past, that put ecological well-being first.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on today. If our survival literally depends on the stories we tell, which worldview will you actively help bring to life? Are you going to stick with the myth of mastery and inevitable destruction, or will you choose a new story, one of kinship, mutability, and a shared pluriverse? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it changes the way you read the world around you.